Welcome to the Modern Homesteading Podcast.
We have allowed ourselves to become so disconnected and ignorant about something that is as intimate as the food that we eat.
Be prepared to grow your own for victory.
God said, I need somebody strong enough to clear trees and heave bales, yet gentle enough to yean lambs and wean pigs and tend the pink-combed pullets who will stop his mower for an hour to splint the broken leg of a meadowlark. So God made a farmer.
Today we're going to talk about the topic of food forests. Specifically, should you grow a food forest on your property? Now, food forests are something that I've always been a huge fan of. I watch a lot of YouTube videos on them. I've studied a lot of them. I read a lot of books on them. And I started one a couple years ago on my own property. You could say I kind of always was working towards food forests in a way. Every time I planted a fruit tree, I start putting guilds around them. And these are the beginnings of a food forest. But when I bought the property next door to me that was basically a vacant lot, I started specifically working towards building a food forest. And I'm still in the early stages of that. I have a lot of trees still left to plant, a lot of support species to put around those trees and guilds, and it's coming a long ways. But should you grow a food forest on your property if you have some land? And so what I want to talk about today is kind of what is a food forest, how much land is needed to grow a food forest, and how long does it take to grow a permaculture food forest. So these are questions that often get asked when someone's contemplating starting a food forest on their property. So I want to kind of cover those things today. First of all, what is a food forest? Well, let's just kind of go with the textbook type definition. It's just when someone plants a large variety of plants that will eventually produce food. And they do this in a way that mimics the ecosystems and the patterns that you find in nature. Food forests are planted and grown in ways that will encourage food production, but they're also called forest gardens because they are designed that way. They're designed to function a lot like a forest, but specifically to provide food for humans and your livestock, things like that, for people to enjoy. They're designed to be more useful for you. People plant food forests to be able to eat out of their garden, eat off their land, and not rely on grocery stores. And it's really because it functions like a forest, it's actually more productive for less work once it's established. Now, that's not saying that establishing a food forest isn't a lot of work. What we find is that food forests are designed in layers. So you have what's called an overstory or a canopy layer, and this is your tallest layer. It's usually made up of large fruit and nut trees that thrive on the full sun. And then you'll have like an understory layer, and these are your smaller fruit and nut trees, and these trees are usually more shade tolerant. Now, you can skip the taller overstory layer, in which case the understory layer of your fruit trees and your nut trees there become your overstory layer. You're basically cutting off a layer. Sometimes can be less productive or less. What you'll find is you're getting less things in your food forest, but you're focusing on things you'd rather have, like the fruit and nut trees, a smaller fruit and nut trees. And that's kind of the angle I have taken mostly. Now, I do have just a couple of what I would consider larger overstory trees, but most of my trees are going to be those smaller fruit and nut trees, and they're going to actually become my overstory layer. So in essence, I skip the top layer and skip to the next layer, which again becomes my top layer. Then you have what's called the shrub layer, and this can consist of any number of fruit and berry producing shade tolerant shrubs. This is probably what I consider kind of one of the easiest layers, because you have all your berry bushes, and your small shrubs that produce a lot of food every year. They just continually come back, and yet they really don't take any work, and it's actually the easiest to and least expensive and quickest production for what you get as far as a quick return on your planting and just coming back every year. So I like the shrub layer. Huge fan because it's your berry bushes and things. Grandkids love that. We all love to walk around our food forest and pick the blueberries and the raspberries and things like that. Then you have your vine layer. Now, these are your shade tolerant climbers, and they can use the surrounding overstory and understory as trellises. So it's again a productive layer that will you'll have your blackberries, your kiwi. There's several plants that fall in this layer that you can add depending on your. It absolutely will depend on your zone you're growing in. Grapes are a common one that people will use in their food forest. I actually have my grapes separated from my food forest because I like to have them kind of by themselves, but absolutely they would fit right into a food forest if you wanted them to. The herbaceous layer, this is the layer that can be a variety of perennial and annual herbs, leaf-bearing plants. These will accommodate one another and the guild as a whole. And again, this is what I like about these layers is you see quick return on these layers. And these, like I said, these can be perennial or they can be annual. I find myself planting a lot of annual herbs every year, but I have several perennials in there as well. Your ground cover layer. These are the horizontal spreading crops that cover the soil around the upper layer. Plants providing food and benefiting the soil. So you might have things that are going to benefit you with some stuff, but you might have things like clover that maybe not benefit you so much directly, but they're going to benefit the other plants by being a nitrogen fixer. It might be a good pathway plant for you. I mean, it doesn't all have to be about food. It can support you in other ways. It can support you by supporting your food plants. It can support you by providing a tool for the area. And I find clover does that really well. But I also have things like purslane that I would consider a ground cover layer that is a fantastic food as well. Then you have the rhizosphere layer, and this is the root crop layer, which is mostly made up of annuals and biennials, like your onions and things like that, garlic. A very beneficial a layer. I find this a good support layer, especially if you're dealing with things like onions and garlic and things like that, because it's good for pest control. They're a good support layer all around. But then you have things like carrots. You have things like turnips, which you can also use as cover crops in that layer. There's a lot of good root crops in this layer that fit well into a permaculture food forest. Something that's not universally recognized as a layer. It's kind of like this eighth layer that a lot of folks just don't necessarily regard as a layer, but it's the mycelial layer, and this is the mushroom layer, and it's mostly subterranean. It can produce edible mushrooms, but it doesn't have to. It can just be that mycelial layer that's underneath the soil. And if you ever pull your soil back, you'll see evidence of that layer. And it's a good support layer. And the reason it's not always considered a layer is because it's always there. If you have healthy soil, it's there. But it can provide you food in the form of mushrooms. And it's something you can add in, again, to this layer. It doesn't have to be just natural. It's something you can put there. So those are your layers of the food forest that make up this food forest. Some benefits of having a food forest. Food forests don't typically have many weeds if they're designed right, because of the overstory layers and the shade, and because you've planted it very thick with things that you want there. They don't have a lot of weeds generally. They don't need a lot of fertilizer because you do practice chop and drop, and this chop and drop is the fertilizer that they need for to support the surrounding plants for the healthy soil. Food forests are usually great for insects because they include a variety of plants that attract insects. You think, well, that's not a good thing, right? Well, it attracts a balance of insects, both good and bad. You are not going to have beneficial insects if you don't have your predatory insects, if you don't have things for them to prey upon. So it will invite a few of the bad insects, but it also invites the good insects. So you get this balance, this nature-like balance that you need in a healthy ecosystem. It may attract things like deer and rabbits, but if you're setting your food forest up correctly, you might have plants that will deter them, or you may have plants that actually are substitutes for them to eat rather than going for your more valued crops. Like I have fruit trees. Well, rabbits will walk up and eat the bark off of fruit trees. But if you surround them with things like comfrey and things like they prefer to eat, they'll eat those things instead. And those are those are valuable plants to have in your food forest, but they won't eat your comfrey plants dead generally. I mean, it's just something they won't do. So you can add things like that around a more valuable plant that will keep them off your more valuable plants and turn them onto plants that they really can't damage too severely. Food forests don't need to be replanted every year because you've planted it with perennials and things that'll come back, and you might add a lot of annuals in that, but they're annuals that, again, you're going to add in because you want them as a crop, but it doesn't take as much work. You can kind of sporadically put them in places where you want them. It won't need to be sprayed with herbicides and pesticides that will kind of harm your delicate ecosystem, because you built up a very tolerant, working, symbiotic relationship between these plants that'll prevent that from being necessary. And like a forest, it takes years for a food forest to be fully developed. And I want to talk about that later, fully developed to be self-sustaining. But to give you kind of a hint of what's coming, some parts of that will be self-sustaining and providing a yield for you very quickly. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. That's kind of what a food forest is. So let's talk about how much land is needed to grow a permaculture food forest. You might think, well, I'm in a city. I got a tenth an acre or a quarter acre. I don't have room for a food forest. So how much room is needed? How much land is actually needed to grow a permaculture food forest? Because it's a question that I've asked myself in the past. I live in town. I don't have a huge yard. I mean, before I bought the property next door, I had a tenth of an acre. Now I have a little over double that because there's not a house on the property next door. So, yeah, I mean, I have a little under a quarter acre, I would say. Is that enough to grow a food forest? Was a tenth of an acre enough to grow a food forest? What does it take to grow a food forest? Well, the fact is a permaculture food forest can grow just about anywhere, from a backyard to a farm. A food forest aims to mimic nature by allowing various plants to grow, in a self-sustaining ecosystem. So what does it take to do that? Any patch of land. No matter the size or the area, really. If you have some land that can have a tree or two and some supporting plants around it, you can have a food forest. The bigger, the better, I will say, and more balanced. The bigger the food forest is, the more balanced and self-sustaining it really becomes. The more plants you can add that will support each other, the better it is. But I consider a 2-tree guild with supporting plants a food forest. I mean, it can be. If it's supplying you food and it's functioning in the way that a food forest functions, it's a food forest. And what's that look like? Yeah, it can look like a lot of things. It has to be self-sustaining, it has to be successful, and it has to be profitable. What do I mean by that? Self-sustaining means that if you don't take care of it, does it take care of itself? Does it function like a forest works? Once it's established, once it's fully established, that is, do you need to add anything? Do you need to bring in inputs to keep it going, to make it survivable? Does the soil feed itself? Does it produce? Is it profitable in that way? Does it bring you a yield? That's a food forest. You don't need a large piece of land. Matter of fact, I said that it's more sustainable, it's more productive if it's larger. But the fact is, it's easier to maintain if it's smaller. I mean, it's easier to do your chop and drop, because chop and drop is a part of being of a food forest that you really have to do. You have to maintain it some. You have to go out there and you have to. If you're going to feed your soil, you want to practice the chop and drop and things like that. It's actually much easier to maintain on a small piece of land than that way. It will take care of itself better and more sustainable in that way if it's larger, but the smaller it is, it's easier if you have to maintain it. It can be spread out. It don't have to be confined and all together. It can be in a little bit in your backyard, a little bit in your front yard, a little bit beside your house. It can be all around. You can put various guilds around your place that become food forest for you. It's just important to practice things like companion planting, covering your soil with food-bearing plants. You don't want things to go to waste. You want to use that space in a forest, because like in a real forest, in an actual forest, nothing goes to waste. What we consider not beneficial plants to us are beneficial to the forest. They attract things. They feed the soil. They support the other plants. They do things that benefit the food forest or the forest. It could be that way in your food forest as well. They need to benefit one another. Yes, you can have things like garden beds, like raised beds in a food forest. They can be tied into between a guild to support and benefit that area. and just allow those beds to overflow with anything that will thrive in them. Yeah, obviously, the more space you have, the better to provide for your needs. But the fact is, numbers have been crunched by other people. And if you want to feed your family with a food forest, it's been estimated that around 1/30 of an acre per person will support will feed your family. Well, that's about a 38 by 38 foot space. Think about that. That's not very much room per person to feed yourself with a food forest. That's a low maintenance way of establishing a self-seeding area that will feed your family. So it doesn't take as much room as you might think, but maybe you have a little bit bigger area. Maybe you have 1 acre or larger. This would be you could develop a small farm scale food forest, something that you not only are providing for your family, but providing for other families. You're selling the food, you're selling that yield to provide a food for others. And you can do that with an acre or more. And generally in something this big, you're setting up orchards, a permaculture orchard. You're setting up a foraging zone of berries and nuts and anything that can be foraged. Again, you're going to have all those layers I mentioned earlier, but it's a little more self-sustaining. The ecosystem will be a little more thriving, and season after season, it will not only provide you for food, but it'll also provide others for food. And then there's those large scale, extremely large scale food forests that, that's more commercial, but it can be done. Absolutely. There are people doing this. There are people working this out. That's not only providing these very extreme large scale food forests are not only providing vegetation, but also providing a lot of animals because they're running animals through those food forests as well. So, the food forest concept, it doesn't take as much land as you might think. It can be done in a small backyard, or if you have more, great. More is better. It really is. Now, a question that often gets asked is, well, I need to feed my family now. I don't want to wait 10 years for my food forest. And it was something I struggled with because, I'm trying to eat out of my garden for my health, for the health of my family. I'm trying to provide for us. And a food forest does take a little time to establish, right? It does. To provide fully, to be fully sustaining and fully providing a yield, yes. It takes a long time to do that. Those 8 layers take some time to develop. But the fact is, for a food forest to reach full maturity at every layer, yeah, it can take several years. However, those lower 3 layers of the system, referred to as the ground cover layer, the root layer, the vine layer, even if you want to go into that mushroom layer, they can reach full maturity in weeks to months, just like your regular garden, and provide an abundant yield for you. Yeah, you might have to wait on those fruit trees and those nut trees to provide for you. But the fact is, the rest of it can provide for you immediately. You will obtain a yield the first year if you plan it accordingly. If you plant the right things, if you set it up right, if you design your permaculture food forest to provide for you in that way. Your understory tree layers, yeah, they might take a little longer, 2 to 5 years to start providing for you. That overstory layer, yeah, several years to provide for you, especially with the nut trees. 8 to 10 years. A pear tree is in that layer, could be in that layer, 3 to 10 years. Pecans, 6 to 12 years. Walnuts, 8 to 10. Yes, it can take a while. Get your apples and all that going. It can take a while. Maybe you want things, though, that provide for you a little quicker. Peach is pretty quick. There's just some trees and things that will do better. But then we start getting down into our shrub layers, and generally weeks to months, you could have berries growing in your backyard, elderberry and blackberries and raspberries and goji berries and, all these things that will give you food, put food on your plates. That herbaceous layer, there's going to be things that grow that year. All your herbs that you want to cook with, they're going to be there. Things that will provide for you in medicine. There's lots of things in that herbaceous layer that can be medicine for you that first year. There's plenty annual herbs that can provide for you immediately. Those ground cover layers like nasturtiums and clover and purslane, those things can provide for you the first year. The root layer, again, first year, you're going to have yields. You're going to have things like turnips and beets and radishes. Radishes you're going to have in just a matter of a few weeks, 30 days, 40 days, you're going to have radishes out of your garden. These things are going to provide for you immediately. Vine layers, things like cucumbers, 1 year. Kiwi, grapes. I mean, yeah, it might take a little more time to establish, but again, 1 to 2 years, you can have things like that in your garden providing for you. Food forest doesn't necessarily take a long time. It doesn't necessarily take years and years and years to fully establish. You can set it up to establish for you to provide a yield for you quicker. You want those things. You want those things 5 years from now, 8 years from now. I mean, it's just going to be so abundant and so providing you with so much provision. But you know what? That time is going to pass regardless whether they're planted or not. Plant them, get them started, get them in the garden, and then let them grow and start planting them, supporting species around them that will feed you now, feed you just as quick as your raised bed garden in your backyard. It'll feed you just as quickly as if you tilled up an acre of ground and started planting things in rows and monocropping. It will feed you. It'll look different. And when it's all fully established, it'll be more self-sustaining. It will be more reliant. It will be more resilient to things like drought and all these things. If you set it up correctly, it can be a much better, safer, self-reliant, self-sufficient, sustainable, resilient way of feeding your family for years to come. So I'm a big fan of food forests. I'm working on them slowly. I am nowhere near planted out in my food forest where I need it to be because it takes a lot of time. And to be honest, the first couple of years, I've been kind of slow going with it. I've got some support species out there. I've got pecan, I've got pawpaw, I've got apple, I've got pear, I've got peach, I've got plum. I've put in hazelnut, and I mean, I've got all these things growing, and several other things, as far as the, understory and overstory trees, but I have a long way to go, and I'm starting to plant the support species around them. I'm starting to work in my shrub layer. I'm starting to work in my other layers around those trees, but I planted them when they were very small trees. I'm talking like 12-inch trees, I mean, they were very small trees. So it's taking a long time to establish. But we're really now just getting to where I'm starting to build those guilds around those layers and really starting to establish what I consider a food forest. And I have a long way to go. I have more trees to plant. I want to put in more trees, more overstory and more understory trees in those areas. So I have a long way to go. But we can build this together. It's great that I can build it and talk about it at the same time. So let's do this together. Let's start even if it's just a couple fruit trees in your small backyard. Let's get those planted. Let's get those ready. Let's get those started, and let's start putting some guilds around them, some support species around them, and let's start building these layers. And let's establish some resiliency into our garden, something that will be there for years to come for our families. So there you have it. Just kind of an overview of getting started with food forests and can you even or should you even grow a food forest on your property? I believe you should. If you have any space at all, if you have any land at all, I believe you should be growing a food forest on your property. So that's all I'll say on that. And I'm going to thank you for joining me, and we'll talk to you again next week.